Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just letting everyone join. We're kicking off our webinar here. Warm greetings from Oxford. Happy to say it is actually warm today. It's a first for us in the last couple of weeks. So I know we've got people joining from all over the world. So it's fantastic to have you joining us. I'll just let people come in and join the audience. Great. Okay, so let's start to kick off. We're here today on this webinar, which is a really exciting topic and incredibly timely. So the theme that we'll be discussing today is the topic of net zero and moving from science to strategy. So moving from what we know around the science to what ideally you would be able to do in your own organizations. And I realize that you'll be coming from many different sectors, many different industrial areas, and perhaps some of you in advisory roles or finance roles. And so we hope that we'll be able to have you walk away with some themes, some frameworks, some ways of thinking that can really help you to do your work in a way that brings the science to your strategy. So really thrilled to be here. I'm Dr. Mary Johnstone-Louise. I am at the Said Business School, and I'm really delighted that I'm here with our partners from across the university. So this is Sam Frankenhauser and Alexis McGivern, who are both our colleagues at the Smith School for Geography and the Environment. And what's really special about this is we've come together because we understand that in order to fully come alongside what organizations and corporations need to do in terms of their strategy, it's something that we need to use all the abilities of the university to really support. And so we're really delighted to be partnering with the Smith School at the business school here and coming to you with what I hope will be a really multidisciplinary and useful set of approaches here today. So warm welcome. I'll just pass to the next slide. Ross is our AV support. Thanks, Ross, so much. Here's what we'll be doing today. So you'll see that there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use that as we go. So there'll be lots of questions that come up as we're walking through the content. Use the Q&A. And you can also upvote each other's questions if that's something that resonates with you. And then we'll save some time, at least 20 minutes at the end, possibly even a little more if we're able, to make sure that we are using this to be as interactive a space as possible. And so Alexis will be working through those questions, and ideally we'll even have the chance to invite you to go on to video and ask your question on screen if you'd like to do that. No obligation, but please do use the Q&A actively and go ahead and upvote if there's questions that resonate with you. So we'll work first from hearing from Professor Frankhauser on the science of net zero. Then we'll move to Alexis McGivern, who will speak to the governance and regulatory side of net zero. I'll share kind of tailing the piece on the strategy, and then we'll move to hopefully that videos on interactive Q&A. And then we're really excited to also have the opportunity to share with you something that we've developed together. So it's great to be on a webinar, even better to be in person. And we've actually launched our first collaborative partner program together, which our wonderful colleague Christine will share with you about at the end. And so lots of opportunities here to ask questions and to engage, and we'll close at the top of the hour just to respect everyone's schedules. So super. Ross, next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of what has brought us together and what we really hope you can take away from today, is that really, if you think that I'm from a business school and my colleagues, Sam and Alexis, are very strong on the science and the governance and standards of net zero. And we feel that it's these three pillars that really guide our partnership together. So this idea that actually a really clear understanding of the science of offsets, the science of decarbonization is utterly essential, as is the understanding of how to govern commitments and govern the goals that we have on decarbonization and net zero in particular. And alongside that is also the standards and regulatory frameworks that are coming down the pike. And so we're really thrilled to be able to have Alexis walk you through what's coming and what really we all need to be more and more aware of. And then I think what we're most interested in is spending time thinking about, for you as an organization, how do you build this pillars from science and governance and standards? How do you build that into your business models and strategy? So this is the way that we as two schools here in the University of Oxford think about our work together and think about our collaboration. And we hope that this is a useful way for you to come in as well. So thanks so much, Ross. Super. I think we have a bit of a poll at the moment. So before we pass on to Sam, can we run the poll? Because it's nice to see sort of where we are in the audience. Okay, so here's just to get us a little bit more interactive. This is this question around if you had to guess, right? What percentage of emissions, so GHG emissions today, are covered by some form of a net zero target? Okay. So it's a single choice. Take a moment, use your gut, use what you know, and we'll go ahead and see what the group consensus of the room is. And it'll be a really interesting way of seeing sort of where we all are. So please go ahead and engage with the poll, and we'll see where the perceptions are among the audience. Okay, so this is global emissions. All right, and this is a wide definition of some kind of net zero target, right? So what percentage of global emissions are covered by some form of net zero target today? 10% or less, some middle range, 3/4 or more. How are we looking, Ross? Are we seeing some responses come in?
Yes, sorry, Mary, if you have a look, I think yourself on Zoom, if you click on the webinar, the poll tab, you should be able to see the results coming in. But we've got quite a few. So we've got 16% on 10% or less.
Okay,
Uh,
excellent.
the majority, 26%, is there on 10% to 25%.
Okay, 10 to 25 is the majority.
Yeah, but it's still going up and down. We've got 24% for the middle, 25 to 50%.
Okay,
And
interesting.
then it lowers down a bit, yeah. So 17 on 50 to 75%, and then 17 on 70% or more.
Okay, so we'll call time on this poll in just a moment, Ross. I actually can't see it, so you're going to have to do the big reveal, Ross. What was the? I don't know if our participants can see it. I can't see the results, but perhaps you can share, Ross.
Of course, yeah. So sorry, I won't be able to. I'm not sure entirely if I can share it to everyone. I'm hoping if you click on the poll, it should show you the results. But otherwise, I can tell you anyway, it's
Yep.
very close. So the majority is 10% to 25%.
Okay,
Uh,
interesting.
but literally just behind is 25 to 50%.
Okay, really interesting. So look, we have some realists, we have some optimists in the room, and now we're going to really surprise you because as we'll hear more from particularly Alexis when she speaks to some of the work that they're doing in Oxford Net Zero team, the statistic is actually over 80%. So this is remarkable, actually, and I think it's really important to understand why that doesn't feel real to us, right? So typically when we share this stat with business audiences, here we go. Thanks so much. I can now see the poll results. So all right, 17% of you said 75% or more. That's accurate. That's correct. But it's a really interesting question to ask ourselves, particularly from a leadership and strategy point of view. Why does that feel so unreal? Why does that feel so unconvincing, right? And I think a lot of it is around the fact that we know that the quality of those net zero commitments is often very poor, right? So around 22% of them actually meet very basic integrity criteria, for example, having interim kind of, timeline measures of interim goals, the most basic integrity criteria that we could really hope for. And so we know that there's a huge gap between what organizations are saying, and in many cases, what regulations or standards are asking organizations to say, and what is really happening in practice. And so I'll leave that there, but I think it's a really interesting food for thought that really brings us into the need to hear from all three of these pillars, the science, the governance and regulation, and the strategy for the rest of this webinar. So really thanks for engaging with the poll. I hope it got us into the right mindset of being ready to hear how do we move forward and make that stat feel a lot more realistic and credible. So Sam, over to you.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks everybody for joining us and spending an hour with us to talk about net zero. So it's from science to strategy, and I start with the science. So give you the big global picture, if you will, about net zero and the meaning of net zero to set the scene for Alexis on governance and then Mary on the strategy for individual organizations. When I say the science of net zero, I mean science broadly defined. It isn't just sort of the atmospheric physics of net zero. You're talking about engineering science, behavioral science, and economics as well. So it's science broadly understood. And on the next slide, I can quickly show you the two aspects that I want to cover. So the first is a quick recap on the concept of net zero, where it actually comes from and what it means. And then secondly, we just quickly canter through some of the options, the engineering, technology, economic, social sort of strategies that we might have, global strategies that we might have to achieve net zero. And again, hopefully that will set the scene for Alexis and Mary to talk, on a more granular level to what that all means for you and your organizations. So let's start on the next slide with the meaning of net zero. And I don't start here with the science, I start with the diplomacy. And I start with the Paris Agreement, which was adopted 8 years ago, almost 9 years ago, at the Conference of the Parties, where pretty much every country in the world, 196 countries, agreed on what the right target should be on climate change. They agreed what sort of would be a societally acceptable temperature level beyond which we as a community don't want to go. And the answer was that we should remain well below 2 degrees centigrade warming above pre-industrial levels. Ideally, you would keep temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So that's sort of the global consensus. The science then kicks in from there. And on the next slide, the science sort of kicks in as follows. Atmospheric physics is quite complicated, but a lot of the complicated terms sort of cancel each other out, and you get a relatively simple picture if you sort of approximate what's going on. And the simple picture is that each temperature rise is associated with a carbon budget, a certain amount of carbon that you can put into the atmosphere. Global warming just continues in proportion to the cumulative emissions that we put into the atmosphere, which means there's a finite carbon budget that is associated with all temperature levels. And the 1.5 to 2 degree temperature target, scientists have calculated, is associated with about another 250 billion tons of carbon that we can put into the atmosphere. So about 250 gigatons, which is about 8 years worth of currently annual emissions. Now, the question then goes back to society, and the question the society is asked is, how do we use up that carbon budget? Do we use it up quickly, or do we use up slowly? And who has access to that carbon space? The chart that you look at here sort of exemplifies that. If you use up the carbon budget quickly, you continue on business as usual. The red lines there, then you use up the budget very soon, and you have to come down very, very, very fast in terms of reducing your emissions. Contrary to that, if you start reducing your emissions early, you have still a very steep, but a sort of a more measured reduction in carbon emissions over time, which are some of those blue lines. On the next slide, I show you what sort of science suggests what a rational way to reduce carbon emissions should be. If we sort of put all the determinants of what emission reductions depend on, the sort of the technology choices, the innovation, the growth in GDP, the growth in population, behavioral trends, if we put all that in the sort of an economy, climate, energy model, and you optimize that and sort of see what makes most sense, you get a sort of path that looks a little bit like the one we're looking at. There's a range there, obviously, as you can see, so there are options. But broadly speaking, we have to reduce our emissions by about 50% from the sort of current 40 gigaton peak to something half of that within the next 5 years or so in the early 2030s. The carbon space that we have available, those 250 gigatons, will then be used up by about the middle of the century, by about 2050. And that, on the next slide, is when the concept of net zero actually kicks in. Once you've used up that carbon space, once you've used up your 250 gigatons, you have to have a balance, a net zero balance between the amount of carbon that is still released into the atmosphere from the lithosphere there, from the Earth's crust, coal, the oil and the gas, or from the biosphere into the atmosphere. That has to be balanced by carbon that is being removed from the atmosphere. Again, that carbon can be removed down into the biosphere through tree planting, or it can be removed back into the Earth's crust through things like direct air capture. So that's the meaning of net zero, a finite carbon budget that's associated with our temperature goal. And once we've used up that carbon budget, which probably or ideally we would sort of reach by the middle of the century, we have this balance between residual emissions and removal. So let's move on to what that all means. That very quick sort of on the next slide, that or even the slide after that, that very quick sort of introduction to the science of net zero. How do we achieve net zero? And the starting point there is to ask, where do current emissions come from? And I give you 2 slides on that. On this one here, I tell you, sorry, the previous one still, please, Ross. On this slide here, it's emissions by sector. And what you can see here is that lots of sectors, lots of economic activities contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. But if you want to simplify the world a little bit, about 80% or close to 80% of the emissions come from, in one way or another, energy and fossil fuel use. So you have electricity and heat there. You have transport, which is fossil fuel based. You have industry, where there's a lot of heat, process heat, and fossil fuel based emissions. That's about 80% of the story. Land use is about 20% is the rest. So you have agriculture there, and further down you have land use and forestry. So it's really a story of energy with a little bit of land use and agriculture in terms of the sectors. On the next slide then, emission sources by country. And again, the story is that everybody contributes and everybody's emissions count equally. The atmosphere doesn't care where a ton of carbon comes from. A ton of carbon is a ton of carbon. This slide here shows you where the sort of the nature of those emissions by country. You have each one of those blocks is a country or a geography. You see China there, you see the US on the left, and you see India, Africa on the right. On the x-axis, the width of those blocks is the population in those geographies, and the height of those blocks, the y-axis, is emissions per person in those geographies. And if you want to know total emissions, you multiply emissions per person by the number of people. So the size of those blocks is the absolute emissions that come out of those geographies. And you see there the US on the left, a very big chunk, a very big block. Not that many people emitting huge amounts per capita, so you have a narrow high block. On the right of the chart, you have places like Africa, India, large populations not emitting very much, but lots of emissions, very little emissions from lots of people also add up. The US and India are both top 5 emitters globally, but very, very sort of socioeconomic profiles of those emissions. And then you have China in the middle, which does both. Lots of people emitting a fair amount of emissions per capita, which makes China sort of runaway biggest emitter at the moment. About 25 to 30% of global emissions come from China. On the next slide, so now that we understand where those emissions come from, what do we do about them? And I'm introducing a very simple equation here. It's called the Kaya identity, and it is an identity in the sense that it's true. It's not estimated. It's not a measurement. It's a sort of it's a fact. And what the identity tells you is that carbon emissions are the product of exactly 3 factors. And if you want to reduce carbon emissions, it's exactly one of those 3 factors, or a combination of those 3 factors that you have to deal with. The first one is carbon per energy. That's sort of the carbon intensity of the energy sector. That's the story of replacing high carbon fuels like coal and gas with zero carbon fuels like wind, solar, hydro, biomass, perhaps even nuclear. That's the first thing you can do. The second thing you can do is reduce the energy intensity of GDP. That sort of is the story of using less energy per economic output, either because we become more efficient in our appliances or in our industrial processes, or maybe because the structure of the economy changes, because we move from sort of high carbon, electro-intensive manufacturing to services. Or it could also be that behavior changes and we sort of choose to use less energy per unit of what we do. And if those two factors fail, then it's GDP that you have to deal with. So that would make us sort of poorer, reduce economic activity. But in the first instance, what we tried to do is reduce carbon per energy or reduce energy per GDP. And that's what we have to do. And on the next slide, it's a sort of a look forward as to how one might do that. Which one of those dials would you sort of use? There's a sort of a cottage industry, I would say, of models that tell you how one decarbonizes an economy by 2050. And they have a sort of a common structure. They're variations, but they have a common structure. And the common structure is that you start with electric power, with electricity generation, and you clean up electric power. You do that for three reasons. The first one is, if you think back to the sectoral emissions chart, because electricity is a big part of the emissions source. The second reason is we have the technologies to clean up electricity. We have renewables, wind, solar, that are now so cheap that they are the default option in most contexts if you want new electric capacity. So that's the second reason. And then the third strategic reason is, once you have clean electricity, you can use that clean electricity to decarbonize some of the other emission sources. So you can use clean electricity, for example, in the transport sector through electric vehicles. You can use clean electricity in the building sector through heat pumps instead of gas boilers. You can use clean electricity in industry by producing hydrogen and replacing coal with hydrogen. Or in the residual emissions, that net zero story of the net of the carbon removal, you can use clean electricity for direct air capture to suck carbon out of the air. So you start with electric power and you electrify the rest of the economy to clean up the rest of the economy. That's a slightly technological take on decarbonization. There is a lot of behavioral change that goes with it as well, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of how one does that. On my final slide, I quickly tell you where we are on this process. This slide shows you emissions, again, historic emissions, and it shows you forecasts of emissions depending on certain assumptions. And if we assume that, remember the 75% plus percent of emissions that are subject to a net zero constraint, if you assume that those net zero targets will be met by the letter, we will reduce global emissions by towards the end of the century to something like just over 2.2 degrees centigrade. So we would be quite close to where we want to be, quite close to 2 or well below 2, if we could take all those pledges and take them at face value. If we instead look at the policies that underpin those pledges, we're in a much more dire world, and we sort of headed for something like 2.8 degrees centigrade. So the difference and the motivation for this seminar between having a pledge and implementing that pledge is meeting the Paris target or not meeting the Paris target. And with that, I stop and I hand over to Alexis.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's really great to get an insight on what net zero means and why it matters, especially in the context of the Paris Agreement. So I'm Alexis McGivern. I'm the Net Zero Standards Manager at Oxford Net Zero, which is a research group, an interdisciplinary research group based at the University of Oxford. So if I go to the next slide, please. Sam, in your last graph, you had a pre-Paris pathway that showed us going up and up. And you see, even with the pledges that are not yet fulfilled, even with the policy, we're still coming down. And that's different from the pre-Paris trajectory, which had us going infinitely up. And so I think there's a lot of worry and stress around climate change. It's something that I think we all experience, but it's also a really important time to be making the right decisions, especially when it comes to net zero. So I always like to situate myself in the presentation with this quote from Catherine Wilkinson, who's an American climate activist who put together a wonderful anthology called All We Can Save, which is really about, yes, we've lost a lot already, but think about all that we can save if we act on climate swiftly and responsibly. So it's a magnificent time to be alive at a moment that matters so much. And as you said, Sam, we're not close to where we need to be with our policies, but we're much better when we collaborate and work together, like when we came together for the Paris Agreement. So I just want to keep that in mind. We have the possibility to make this work if we work hard. So next slide, please. So I really want to talk about net zero governance. Sam kind of cued me up there with talking about pledges and pledges matter, but also how we actually make sure that that action happens is vital. So this is some data from the Net Zero Tracker. The Net Zero Tracker is an open data initiative that's of which Oxford is one of the 4 counterpart institutions. And we basically track net zero commitments. So of all the Forbes 2000 list, so all the largest publicly listed companies in the world, every city above 100,000 people in population, and every country in the world. And what we look at is whether they've made a net zero target, and also we assess the quality of that target. So this leads us to these statistics here that what we talked about at the very beginning of the webinar, that 88% of emissions, of global emissions, are covered by some form of a net zero target. That translates to the 92% of GDP, and nearly 90% of population lives under some sort of a net zero target. The question then is, how are we actually making sure that those targets are put into reality? So we can go to the next slide, please. This is some data from a forthcoming paper by Professor Thomas Hale and some others who work on the Net Zero Tracker. And this is really looking at both country and company pledges to net zero, and just kind of looking at that data across big world events. So for example, you can see the massive proliferation of, let's look at countries first, of country level targets. After COP25, you can see the number of proposed net zero targets start to increase very rapidly. And by COP26, which is when we already started speaking about the importance of net zero governance, there was quite a high saturation of net zero pledges. And on the company side, we can see that the sort of IPCC special report on 1.5 and the Fridays for Future movement in 2019 really began this upward spiral of net zero targets that are currently either proposed or in corporate strategy. So next slide, please. And so when it comes to net zero, we have what Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, calls a surplus of confusion and a deficit of credibility. This is something that he said right before COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh about how net zero was being used to create promises that weren't necessarily coming true. So Ross, if you could just flick forward, there's some headlines here of just the number of frustrations or worries about net zero being used to greenwash, things that net zero claims coming under criticism or offsets being worthless. We keep going, there's a few other headlines. Yeah, big polluters using net zero to block meaningful action. Net zero is just greenwashing. So a few more. But just to show, thanks Ross, just to show that there's a lot of criticism of net zero being used not only as a physical science principle, but also as an organizing principle for climate action. And this comes largely from this idea that if we premise, if we focus too much on this idea of balancing emissions, then it could be used as a delay tactic to not reduce drastically now and to rely on future removals capacity. So that's why at Oxford Net Zero, we're very interested in the governance of net zero. So that's making sure that anyone who makes a net zero pledge actually has to follow through. And one thing that we do, next slide, please, is look at sort of the best practice across the different elements of setting a net zero target and looking at the net zero governance landscape, which we take to mean the standards, voluntary initiatives, business membership organizations, or orchestration campaigns that give some kind of guidance on what quote unquote good net zero looks like. So good practice for net zero, and we're particularly interested in non-state actors, and specifically under that on corporate strategies for net zero. So we just released a report that was a very meticulous systematic review of the 37 different voluntary initiatives, standards, orchestration campaigns, disclosure frameworks that give some form of guidance on net zero practice, and looked to see whether or not that governance really corresponds to reaching urgency, integrity, and equity on net zero pledges. So we just published this report in May of this year. And in order to make our analysis easier, we divided the net zero governance landscape into 7 elements of a net zero target. So from preparing to quantifying your emissions to setting the actual target, making your plan, counterbalancing any remaining emissions, thinking through the impacts, so the sort of negative externalities of climate action, and then reporting. So next slide, please. This all fit into what we call a conveyor belt governance system for net zero. And that's again borrowed from Professor Thomas Hale, who also works on the net zero tracker. But this idea is that governance moves from voluntary initiatives, so reading right to left, from voluntary initiatives where we understand and work through the frontier of best practice, move that through into orchestration campaigns as we update and refine what those best practice looks like, then into standards where that becomes an auditable standard that you can actually assess people's or specifically corporate action against. And then finally, that sort of hardens and is made binding by regulation. So that this is the conveyor belt that we operate and focus on in our work. So next slide, please. So these are just some of the initiatives that we assessed for our systematic review, and that includes new guidance like the TPT, the Transition Plan Task Force disclosure framework, as well as new updates to previous governance initiatives. This is an update to some work that we did in 2022, where we looked again at 33 initiatives. So we both removed some that were no longer relevant and added some more. Next slide, please. And what we see is that there's really good and increasing convergence around some key areas of what good net zero practice looks like. So there's very wide agreement that targets should focus for 2050, that a legitimate net zero target has interim reduction targets that are usually at intervals between 3 to 5 years, that scope 3 emissions need to be quantified and targeted. There's a lot of guidance on keeping offsets outside of your organizational boundaries. Some best practice that is emerging is making sure that you link executive remuneration to the achievement of climate targets. Something that also came up quite a lot was Paris-aligned lobbying, so making sure that your lobbying and lobbying business groups that you're part of are aligned to the Paris Agreement. And then shifting products and services, shifting your business model towards climate solution, and making sure that you can assess the impacts on a just transition. So these are some of the areas of convergence in the landscape, and we do a more detailed guidance in our report. And then next slide, there's also a lot of areas where there's a real requirement for additional attention and detail. So for example, a lot of the standards require coverage of scope 3 targets, but they define that as including relevant scope 3 emissions categories, and there's very little agreement on what relevant means. There's also guidance on what an acceptable base year would be, or how to select an appropriate base year for your company or your organization. There's also quite a bit of disagreement over whether or not a net zero target is only legitimate if it's been independently audited and verified, and if you also report on data limitations. And some other pieces include, for example, setting a separate target on biodiversity and nature, which is sort of upcoming as the new frontier for best practice. So again, all of this is in our report, which I'll put, which you can find online on the Oxford Net Zero website. Next slide, please. But as I mentioned, one thing that we focus on is understanding the landscape of the conveyor belt. So this is our analysis that looked at voluntary initiatives, but we also look at regulations. This is some work that my colleagues led on last year, which was mapping regulatory instruments on net zero across the G20, and found nearly 400 regulatory instruments across claims and financial product standards, regulation on disclosure, or on procurement. So that would mean having some sort of limitation on government spending that it needs to, for example, only be from vendors that have some sort of science-based target. And then finally on transition plan requirements. So my last minute, I recognize that I've gone over, is just to give a snapshot of regulation, which is that over 400 instruments have been tracked across the G20. Next slide, please. And what we see is a massive proliferation of regulation, specifically on disclosure. There's a kind of a very marked increase in disclosure being the norm and part of regulatory activity on net zero to make sure that you're actually holding true to your promise. Next slide, please. And actually 75% of G20 members have some sort of climate regulation in at least one of the 4 domains that we looked at. So we do see a marked increase in the amount of cover of regulation just overall. Next slide, please. And that really shows a growth from the beginning of our assessment way back in 2007, which is the first kind of regulatory instruments being introduced. So from 1 in 2007 to 77 in 2024, we see an 11-fold growth in regulation. So just the key messages here is that regulation is coming. It's important to know, based on the conveyor belt, that a lot of those voluntary initiatives provide either the seed documents, or a lot of the elements are pulled from the voluntary governance into regulation. So it's really important to be familiar with both. And yeah, there's so much to know here to make sure that those pledges actually become reality. And just as a final takeaway, we had some, next slide, please. We had some general kind of takeaways and which you can screenshot. These are kind of our key takeaways from the report, which again can be found on the Oxford Net Zero website. Thank you so much, and I'll hand over to Mary now.
Thank you so much. So a lot of data to get your head around there. And what I want to do is also just point to the report, which Matilda from the Oxford Net Zero team has kindly popped into our Q&A. And so if you go into the answered questions on the Q&A, thank you so much, Matilda, for putting that report in there, because I know that it's really key to be able to dive into that in more detail. And so I want to leave us time for Q&A, but I also want to leave you, particularly if you're from a corporate space, which I think many of the, we've got over 130 participants on this webinar, and I imagine many of you are from a corporate space. And so what I want to do is, aside from the recording that you'll get and, the ability to dive into the rest of the data through the report that has been put into the Q&A chat, I just want to give you a way into this for your organization, because it can be a lot to get your head around, but there are some principles that can really help you to begin to think about where you start. And so Ross, next slide, please, if you don't mind. What I want to just kick off with is by saying there is a lot of technical complexity in this space, right? But I often, when I'm speaking to leaders, like to lead with this kind of provocation. Some of you may agree, some of you may not. Feel free to pop it in the chat if it's worth more discussion, but I like this as a way of thinking about these problems from a strategy perspective, which is that while, of course, the technical challenges around and the technical opportunities that come that are associated with decarbonization are essential and will be game-changing, whether it's AI or looking at new materials. I think for leaders, and which is probably where many of you are, that the biggest sustainability challenges are not purely technical. They are about leadership. They are about governance. And governance, by that, I mean just what Alexis meant, which is enabling your organization to deliver on commitments. And fundamentally, they're about collaboration. So I'd love to just leave that with you, and we'll move on to the next slide, Ross. So when we think about this statistic that we led with at the beginning in terms of the poll, we look at this coverage and we think it doesn't feel real, right? And that's when we see to the next slide, Ross, please. It's because the quality indicators just simply tell a different story. So we know that while organizations are aware and in many cases making commitments, their ability to link those commitments to a strategic plan and to the changes that are needed in business and business models and the changes that are needed sometimes to capital allocation are just not there. And so I want to give you a way in to think about how you might start. Next slide, please. In order to think about what a business is, right? So if you think about a business, there's many different ways to understand what you do every day, whether it's value creation, serving your customers, providing a return to your shareholders. There are many different ways, but I want to encourage you, as you make sense of the science and the regulation and governance of net zero, which is truly complex, to begin to imagine your own organization as a system. Right? So each business, as we know, if we work in a large organization, there's a very, very significant levels of complexity, often internally. And then our business system operates within natural and social systems, right? And so your business, in order to deliver value, in order to create new products and services, it is reliant on social and natural, including carbon and biodiversity inputs. And so I think when we begin to understand our business in that strategic frame, we begin to become attuned to the kinds of systems on which our business depends, right? So if we move to the next slide, please, Ross. What that can mean is it begins to help us think about what our colleague here at the business school, Colin Mayer, often helps us to think about as purpose. So the purpose of your business, right? And one way of thinking about purpose is that it simply means finding ways, understanding that your business is reliant on natural and social systems, within that, finding ways to create profitable solutions to problems, right? And also while not profiting from creating problems, which I think often is a little bit what we see as companies navigate this space, right? So one thing that I've heard quite recently, which I think was very salient, was that a truly strategic approach to sustainability transitions really involves both the strategy function and the government relations function. So this is what Alexis was getting at around this idea of Paris-aligned lobbying, right? So many times we're in organizations where, perhaps on one side we're doing some great innovative work, and perhaps on the other side we may even be pushing for changes or policy regimes that are perhaps undermining the kinds of sustainability transitions that we need to see. So I think using this as a way to sometimes flesh out and, in some cases bring out the elephant in the room that's present in many of our organizations where we do serve complex and sometimes conflicting goals, this concept can be really, really helpful, just in order to bring some honesty, some integrity and clarity, and to begin to think about, the way that we create value as businesses, given that we don't want to be in a place where we have, almost 90% of net zero, of the emissions covered by net zero, but really seeing less than a quarter of those actually having integrity. So let's try and fill that gap in a kind of more strategic way. So next slide, Ross, if you don't mind. What I want to offer you, just as a way of depending on where you are, is that you can think about the impact that your business has and the way that you engage with net zero as really a trio of options, depending on where you are, right? So first of all, if we have the next slide, please, you can think about the environmental impact of your industry, right? So this might be the emissions that are there, that are present. It can often be wastewater, it can be pollution, it can be resource consumption. So this is the way that you create value, your current business model, your current kind of capital allocation decisions actually has an impact externally, right? And if that's where you're starting, that's really where to start. And there's no shame in that. And really getting your head around what does that impact look like is the first place to begin. And the next slide. Some of us are in industries where actually the external impact on our industry of the effects of climate change is now becoming incredibly significant, right? And so this could be something that has the kind of impact that we're seeing in the insurance industry, for example, where pricing of assets on coasts and pricing of real estate in many contexts has become incredibly difficult and sometimes impossible, rendering entire sectors uninsurable because the risk and the climate risk is simply too great. So that's an impact on, if you're in an industry like that. Agriculture is another where, due to weather pattern changes, you see some fluctuations in prices that are actually having an effect on businesses' ability to be able to plan and to strategize for the long term. So think about not just the way that you are impacting on your environment when you think about the net zero space, also be alert to the way that the alignment or non-alignment to the Paris goals is impacting on your ability to deliver on your strategy. And what we're seeing is companies who are really needing to make significant tweaks on these grounds. Next slide, please, Ross. And then I think where we really want to land is the exact kind of spirit that both Sam and Alexis brought to us at the beginning, which is that we have the three pillars. We have the incredible knowledge that we have of the science. We have the incredible understanding of where what integrity looks like and what the kind of regulatory regimes and the governance tools are available to us. And so what we need to begin to think about, and what I would offer to you as a way in to think about, is to begin to understand what the decarbonization transition looks like in terms of the impacts for your industry, right? And I don't mean this in an opportunistic manner. I mean this in a way that really allows you to begin to align your strategy to where your industry can be or needs to be in line with the Paris Agreement goals, right? So this is, in many cases, going to generate new business models. Sometimes we talk about thinking about business models that might need almost a kind of kind of hospicing or a way of being moved away from, to make room for something that actually has a much more solid base for the long term. And so I would say, I understand that we've thrown a lot of data at you, and there can be a very heavy emphasis on compliance in this space, and we understand that. But I want to leave you with the idea and almost a call to move out of the compliance mindset and into the innovation and strategy problem-solving mindset. Okay, so I want to leave it there, because otherwise we'll have not enough time at all for Q&A. But happy to pass over to you, Alexis, and just begin to understand what we're seeing in the chat. And really happy for Alexis to guide this next part of the session, and we can kind of spend about 10 minutes at least with Q&A, if that works out, and then we'll pass over to Christine.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you for your presentation. So first up, I'd like to invite Cholpon Begalieva to take yourself off mute and ask your question, which was about the ways, tools, and policies to reach net zero. So Cholpon, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Alexis. Thank you for giving me the floor. Yes, my question was, since we're greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 emissions, they are only increasing. So how can we reduce them, and what kind of tools or policies do we have to come to this net zero in practice?
Great. And if you wouldn't mind, just to say maybe where you're calling from, if you're happy to share, or what industry you might be connected with, it'd be great for us to understand a little bit more behind the questions.
Oh, sorry. I'm from Kyrgyzstan. It is in Central Asia, and I work in a commercial bank.
Super. Who would like to take the question?
Maybe I can, or at least Alexis said in the chat I should have a go at it. So let me have that. It's great to. Thanks for your question, Cholpon. I used to work on Central Asia in an earlier life, so it's good to hear your voice from Kyrgyzstan. The first thing I would say is that yes, global emissions keep going up, but there's about 20 plus countries that where emissions have actually peaked, and where emissions are starting to come down. And most of them are developed European countries, but there are also some emerging markets in there, like Mexico, I think Jamaica, various others. And how that's been achieved is sort of, you're absolutely right. It needs policy intervention. It doesn't just happen on its own. And the generic policy interventions tend to be incentives to support clean. So that's subsidies for renewables, that's subsidies for electric vehicles, that's subsidies for research and development. Think sort of US Inflation Reduction Act type interventions. The other set of policies you need is sort of incentivize dirty, so making polluters pay. That can be through a carbon tax, that can be through an emissions trading scheme, that can just be straightforward regulation. Certain things you can just ban once you know what the solution is, and you don't need that sort of experimentation anymore. You just mandate what you want to have. So a lot of countries, or at least I hope in Europe, will sort of within the next 10 years ban the internal combustion engine as for new vehicles. You then have the fleet to turn over, but the new vehicles will all be clean. So it's sort of a mix of things. There's no silver bullet. There's no just economists would tell you just price carbon. That's not true. There isn't just one thing you have to do. It's a combination of many, many different things you have to do.
Thank you so much, Sam. So for the next question, we will come to Pratik Dongre.
We did Hello. Well, let's reassess.
Sorry, Pratik, there's a bit of background noise. So I'm actually just going to read out your question.
Yeah, that's right. So am I visible, or I just can speak my question?
You can speak, yeah.
Okay. No, so I mean, I was just curious about I can see the policy intervention part for achieving the net zero process looks more complicated than the science. Like, of course, science is there. We have a lot of evidence about science, but in terms of policy intervention, in one of the slides, how do you quantify the quality and the trustness of the net zero rules and regulations employed by each country. That I really wanted to know. Yeah, because that's looks to be a really complicated part.
Definitely.
Thank
and
you.
Pratik, where are you calling in from, and what?
So yeah, so I'm originally from India, but I'm a space scientist and technologist working in a satellite manufacturing company in the UK, which is AAC Clyde Space. I'm based in London office, Earth Observation Office in London. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Pratik. So it brings up an important question, because what we've been doing so far is tracking regulation and understanding whether or not an instrument exists, but quality and trust is something more qualitative. So there's actually a newly established regulation and policy hub, Net Zero Regulation and Policy Hub, that's just come out of the Blavatnik School of Government, so the policy school here at Oxford. And that's basically working with law firms on the ground within each of the tracked areas. So looking at all of the G20 and some of the V20, so some of the most climate vulnerable nations in the world, to look at not only whether there's a regulation, but also how well that regulation is actually enforced. So our first analysis last year was just sort of the first test to see whether or not regulation exists. And now we'll be working with partners on the ground to do some more research, which the first iteration of the tracking will be launched, I think, by COP this year. So more to come on that from the Net Zero Regulation and Policy Hub here at Oxford. But it's a really important question, and not one that we didn't manage to cover in our first analysis. So with that, I'll come to the next question to Alison, who had a question about ESG and integrating that into a board structure. So I'll let you take that, Mary. And Alison, if you could say your question, where you're calling in from, and what industry you work in.
Hi, I am capital advisory for the construction sector with Boutique Capital. And what I see all of the time is the disconnect between the hard work that the technical teams and the reporting teams do, and the way that it resonates with the board, and how there is a disconnect there. And I want to know, how do we get over that challenge and embed the ethos into the most influential board members?
Such a great question, Alison. So I have actually put a piece that I co-authored in Harvard Business Review a couple of years back on exactly this question. I popped it into the Q&A. So just so everyone on the call is aware, if you go into the Q&A and you go into the answered questions, we're actually popping resources in there as we go. So please do use that as a way for you to capture those things as we're going. But just to speak to your question, Alison, I think it's absolutely spot on. I want to point you to a resource called Chapter Zero. It is actually something that came out of Cambridge, but it is so good that I actually mention it because it's just that excellent. So Chapter Zero is really focused on working directly with board members and board directors to help them to, first of all, get up to speed and aligned on their governance responsibilities and sort of the skills and competencies that they need in order to govern on particularly climate. They speak a little bit more widely to the broader set of ESG issues, but they really do come from a climate space. So if you're working with boards who are struggling with this, Alison, I really do recommend their resources. It's called Chapter Zero, and really, truly excellent. But for the bigger picture, I would just point to sort of 4 areas where I think boards really can find a way in to thinking about their role as directors and thinking about their role as really the stewards of the kind of longer term purpose and health of the company, if you will, is first of all, really using their usual tools, which is understanding climate risk, right? So boards are first and foremost aware of risk frameworks. They understand that way of seeing the world. And so I think understanding the climate risk and also climate opportunity, as I said at the end of my remarks, that's fundamental in terms of helping boards to make sense of these issues, right? Now, of course, we want to move beyond a risk frame, right? Because that's not enough. And it does actually leave us sometimes, Alison, a little bit too close to the compliance frame that we actually want to get away from. So I think the important piece there for board members is actually really beginning to become aware and understand climate change in relation to the company's strategy, right? And this gets into this question of, do you start with the impact that you have externally? Do you start with the impact that dynamics have on you? Or do you start with opportunity? But I think bringing in that strategic piece is fundamental to board members' role in this area. I think there's also a piece around finding and identifying the existing governance structures that are there to even support the kinds of commitments that companies are making and assessing them, right? And beginning to understand, are they fit for purpose? And I think we're often in a situation where we're finding, no, they're not. And then the final piece is, of course, that boards are responsible for the company's reporting strategy and the reporting, not just from a compliance perspective, but I see the role of the boards as actually needing to pull back that reporting into the strategy and thinking, the idea is that this data is not useful if it's not applied to decision making. And I do see that actually as a really fundamental role of the board to push back against a kind of compliance-based mindset, which is very, very natural in this space, and to continue to ask the question, how is this being used in our strategy and how is it informing our approach and the decisions that we take? So I hope that's useful, but I really do point you to chapter 0. And I know we're at 5 minutes. And so I want to pass to you, Alexis, and see, are we taking more questions, passing to Christine? What's your call? I know we've got so much more we could discuss.
Yeah, I think we'll do one more very quick question that Trisha O'Keefe has submitted, but she is not able to ask it. So I'll just read it out. Tim Lenton talks about positive tipping points, such as EV adaptation, etc. However, given the current political environment globally, curious about the pushback and potential reversal of policy changes. So I'll come to Sam in a very quick 1 minute of thoughts, and then we'll pass to Christine.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. We are sort of looking at that here as well. In Oxford, we call them sensitive intervention points, but it's the same concept as a tipping point. It's that idea that the sort of a targeted intervention can move a system into a new equilibrium. I would say we're sort of we have to worry about reversal, but there's at least 2 technologies where I'm optimistic that we're past the sort of the tipping point or close to being past the tipping point. The first one is renewable energy, which is now so cheap and getting cheaper that even in, sort of climate skeptic jurisdictions like Texas, most of the new power investment is in renewables, is in wind in the case of Texas. So we're probably past the tipping points there. Electric vehicles, we're very, very close in the sense that the industry, the automotive industry has switched. There's next to no investment or R&D going into the internal combustion engine. It all goes into electric vehicles. So they're tipping points that they're still fragile, but I like to think we're past them. And, politicians can do a lot of damage, but the market is getting more and more resilient.
Thank you so much, Sam. Really appreciate it. We have so many other questions that unfortunately we do not have time to get to. So with that, I'll pass over to Christine to speak a little bit about our course upcoming.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. And we'll do our best to keep up in the chat as we go. It's clearly a hot topic. Christine, please, I'd love for you to share a little bit about what you're doing in person, not just online.
Yes, thank you. I hope everyone can see me. So thank you so much, everyone. And thanks to everyone who's joining us here in the call. So I just wanted to talk about something really exciting that we've put together. A lot of you are coming from businesses and corporate. So if this resonates, please let me know if you would like to have a conversation with me, and I can tell you more about the details of the course. So we do have a new program that we've just launched. It's called the Oxford Sustainable Business Program. And what this program offers is a coming together of the expertise of 3 leading Oxford institutions, namely Said Business School, the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment, and also Oxford Net Zero. So this is a uniquely multidisciplinary program that brings together the expertise of Oxford scientists leading on the topic of climate change, and also the expertise of the business school faculty that were known to train the world's leading business leaders to create transformation in their businesses. And also, of course, the world leading research by Oxford Net Zero. And this is a program that really allows participants to create an action plan that they can take to their businesses so they can actually implement their strategy for decarbonization. So it's moving from governance and reporting and really taking real action that actually feeds into your bottom line. So it becomes a competitive advantage for you. So I will drop my details below if you'd like to know more. But if this program resonates with you, it's happening this October, the 21st to the 25th. It runs for 5 days, and it's happening in our Oxford campus in the Saïd Business School. The tuition fee includes the tuition, materials, and also the meals. And we're, as you know, if you've been to one of our programs before, we create a full Oxford experience. So you'll have a memorable time with us in Oxford as well. So if you'd like to sign up, if this is something that speaks to you, I'll pop the links in the chat so you can apply, or you can book a call with me and we can have a consultation call.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We're very excited to, I think, come together across the university, because to the point of the 3 pillars that I shared at the start, this idea of science, regulation, and governance and strategy, we really feel that, especially looking at the gap between what we're seeing organizations desire to do, commit to, feel forced to do, sometimes by regulation, and then the pressures that are then present on their business models and on your ability to create value. It really is time to begin to bridge that gap. And so that's the intent. We'll be doing more webinars like this. We're delighted to see so much engagement and really, really grateful. And I think we'll be looking, so all of you have asked if you can receive the recording. You will receive the recording, so watch this space. And I hope that it's been a really, really useful time for you. We look forward to more, and certainly reach out to Christine, or also just to keep in the loop around the series of events that we'll do on this topic. So thanks so much for joining. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.